What if you were completely alone, no one around for miles, and the silence wasn't peace, but a warning? You tell yourself you're safe, but then you hear it, a sound that doesn't belong, a whisper where there should be none, the kind of noise that chills your skin and quickens your heartbeat, making you question everything you thought you knew about being alone. Tonight, you'll hear 3 true stories from people trapped in isolation. Stories where the quiet was shattered by something unseen, something that should never have been there. But before we get into these chilling tales, here's something important. Many viewers miss out on the darkest, most unsettling stories because they don't subscribe. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because the night is just beginning, and the silence holds many more secrets. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. The night is still young, and the terror is waiting to unfold. Now let's dive in. Emily had retreated to this small, weathered house deep in the forest to recover from an illness that had left her weak and drained. No visitors were expected, no interruptions, no voices. Just the cold embrace of winter outside and the comforting stillness inside. Snow lay thick on the ground, muffling every sound, blanketing the world in a heavy silence that seemed almost unnatural in its completeness. The house sat alone on a narrow dirt road, miles away from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by towering trees stripped bare by frost. Inside, the air was cold but still, untouched by the sounds of life beyond these walls. Her footsteps echoed softly on wooden floors, each creak amplified in the vast quiet. The windows framed scenes of bleak gray skies and endless white, a world frozen in time. She spent her days wrapped in blankets, listening to the faint whistle of wind through cracks in the old walls. No laughter, no music, no radio, only the subtle rhythm of her own breath and the occasional drip of melting icicles outside. Her isolation was meant to be healing, a chance to let her body mend in peace. She welcomed the solitude, believing it to be a refuge. Yet, as the hours stretched into days, the emptiness began to feel different. It was not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something unseen. An awareness that the silence was not empty at all, and that in this quiet, something else had made its home with her. At first, the subtle changes were easy to dismiss, small, almost imperceptible shifts in the quiet. A misplaced object here, a door slightly ajar there. Nothing that seemed out of place enough to demand attention. But in the solitude of that frozen house, every detail became magnified, every creak and whisper a question unanswered. She told herself it was exhaustion, or the fog of her illness playing tricks on her mind. The mind, after all, is an intricate landscape, especially when left alone for too long. It wanders, it invents, it sometimes twists reality into shadows. Yet the sensations grew more persistent, cold spots appearing suddenly as she moved from room to room, a faint breath of air where there should have been none. The nights brought with them a deeper unease. The house settled, or so she thought, but the sounds began to multiply. Soft footsteps on the floor above, though the house was single-storied. Faint tapping on windows, the delicate patter of something brushing against the siding. At times, when the wind was still, a quiet, rhythmic tapping from within the walls themselves, too regular to be random, too deliberate to be dismissed. She found herself pausing in doorways, listening, waiting, heart pounding against ribs like a frantic drum. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow heavier, stretching longer, darker, moving with a subtle, unsettling life of their own. Shapes seemed to flicker at the edge of vision, vanishing when looked at directly. She could feel, rather than see, the presence that lingered nearby. There was no name for this something. No face, no form, just a weight in the silence that pressed down, a coldness that settled deep within her bones. And with every passing hour, the house felt less like a refuge and more like a trap, a place where the quiet was watching. As the days blurred into nights, the quiet presence in the house grew bolder, no longer content to remain hidden in the edges of her perception. The subtle signs became harder to ignore. Things shifted when she wasn't looking, as though unseen fingers traced the edges of her world. Objects she was sure she'd left untouched were suddenly out of place. A chair slightly turned, a book resting open on a page she did not remember reading. There were the sounds, too, always just beyond clear hearing. A faint rustling behind the walls, the soft brush of fabric against floorboards, the delicate tap, tap, tap that echoed through the silent rooms. On some nights, the air itself seemed to thicken, as if the very atmosphere conspired to suffocate any hope of comfort. She tried to reason with herself. It must be the wind, the old house settling, or the whisper of animals skittering outside in the snow. But then the whispers began, not loud, not clear, but insistent. Voices just beyond comprehension, threading through the silence like a cold draft. Sometimes a name, whispered with a softness that drew her closer and repelled her all at once. The darkness deepened in the corners of her vision. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, pooling and shifting with a will that defied the flickering candlelight. She caught glimpses, fleeting and vague, of a figure standing silently, watching, always just out of reach. No face, no features, only the sense of eyes that held endless waiting. Sleep became impossible. Dreams bled into waking moments, twisting reality with memories she could not trust. The feeling of being watched turned into certainty. Every creak, every breath of air felt like a message she could not decode. And then the house itself seemed to breathe, a slow, measured rhythm that pulsed beneath her feet, filling the space with a life that was not her own. She was not alone, never truly alone, and whatever shared this space with her was growing restless. One night, as the world outside lay blanketed in frost and silence, she awoke to a chill far deeper than the winter's breath. The darkness in her room felt thicker, heavier, as if the very shadows had gathered and descended upon her. She lay still, heart hammering, breath caught somewhere between hope and dread. And then she saw it. Not a shape, not a figure, but a presence that pressed against the edge of sight, just beyond the reach of the feeble candlelight. It did not move as a person moves. It did not breathe or blink. It was simply there, a dark absence within the room, an emptiness that seemed to swallow the air around her. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, traced the silhouette's outline, a hollow space where a face might be, shifting and swirling as if formed from smoke or shadow. It was watching silently, patiently, waiting for something she could not understand. Frozen in place, she felt a weight settle over her chest, a coldness that seeped into her bones, chilling her to the core. The room seemed to close in, the walls bending inward as if trying to trap her within that suffocating stillness. Then a sound, soft, deliberate, unmistakable. A slow tapping, rhythmic, echoing in the silence, coming from just behind her. She dared not turn. The air grew colder still, and a whisper slipped through the darkness. A breath of sound carrying no words, only the faintest trace of a voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. In that moment, the boundary between what was real and what was imagined shattered, leaving her alone with a presence that refused to be unseen, a darkness that would not release its hold. When morning finally came, the house was silent once more, but she was gone. The only trace left was the faint imprint of cold where she had lain, and the echo of that unspoken presence waiting patiently in the empty room. When the neighbors discovered the house the next day, they found the door wide open, swinging gently in the cold wind. Inside, everything was as she had left it. A chair tipped slightly, a blanket folded neatly on the worn sofa, but no sign of her. There was no note, no explanation, only an overwhelming stillness that felt heavier than before. Strangely, no footprints marred the fresh snow outside, no trail leading away from the house. It was as if she had vanished into the very air itself, swallowed by the silence she had once sought for healing. In the days that followed, the house remained empty, yet those who dared to approach spoke of hearing soft breathing in the rooms, faint footsteps pacing just beyond the walls. Some claimed to see fleeting shadows flicker in the corners of their eyes, shadows that seemed to watch and wait. Was it loneliness that took her? Or something else, something that had been waiting in the quiet all along? Her story became a whispered warning, a reminder that sometimes isolation does not bring peace, but opens a door to something far more unsettling. And in the darkest corners of solitude, some presences are patient enough to wait, for days, for weeks, perhaps forever. David was an ordinary man, living alone in a modest apartment in the heart of the city. But as the world outside shut down and the streets emptied under strict quarantine orders, his life shrank into the confines of this small space, for walls that soon felt less like shelter and more like a cage. The apartment was cramped, its narrow hallways echoing unnervingly with every step, every distant sound muffled by thick walls and closed doors. Outside, the city's usual hum faded into a haunting silence, leaving only the soft, persistent tick of the clock and the occasional creak of the aging building. In this solitude, David's attention began to fixate on a door he had long overlooked. Tucked away in a shadowed corner, a simple panel door with a lock he had never bothered to open. It was the kind of door that could easily be forgotten, dismissed as a storage closet or a utility access. But as the days stretched on, that locked door became a focal point of restless curiosity. Why had he never opened it? What lay behind it? The questions circled his mind, growing louder in the silence. And then one day, the quiet gave way to an impulse he could no longer resist. With trembling hands, David reached for the handle, unaware that beyond that door lay something that would unravel the very fabric of his isolation and change everything he thought was safe in the world he knew. David's days passed in a rhythm dictated by the quiet walls that enclosed him, punctuated only by the dim glow of his laptop and the occasional distant siren wafting through the stale air. The apartment, once just a place to rest, began to feel like a world unto itself, claustrophobic, unchanging, and haunted by an oppressive stillness. He wandered the narrow hallways often, searching for distractions from the endless monotony. It was during one of these restless walks that his eyes settled on the door, that small, locked door that he had never given a second thought. The door was tucked away near the back of the apartment, shadowed by the low light and overlooked amidst the clutter. At first, it was just a background detail, something to ignore. But over time, it pulled at his attention like a whisper in the dark. David found himself returning to it again and again, running his fingers along its smooth surface, tracing the cold metal of the lock. Questions spun through his mind, growing heavier with each passing day. Why was it locked? What was inside? Had he ever even seen the door open? His imagination began to fill the silence with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Was it a forgotten storage space, cluttered with forgotten memories? Or something more unusual, a space that had been sealed off for reasons unknown? At night, the locked door seemed to hold a presence. In the dark, faint sounds seemed to emanate from behind it, a soft scraping, a barely audible sigh, like the apartment itself was breathing just beyond the threshold. David would sit nearby, heart pounding, straining to hear more, willing the silence to break. Days of quarantine had stretched his mind thin, and the isolation made every shadow a threat, every creak a warning. The door, once a mere curiosity, had become an obsession, a secret that refused to stay hidden. Then one evening the silence broke. David's hand trembled as he reached for the cold handle, a wave of hesitation washing over him. Beyond this door lay an unknown that would shatter the fragile boundaries of his safe world, forcing him to confront what lurked within the walls of his own home, and the unsettling truth that some doors are locked for a reason. The moment David turned the handle, a shiver ran down his spine, not just from the cold that seemed to seep from the crack beneath the door, but from an instinct deep within him, warning that something was wrong. The handle rattled unexpectedly, as if touched by an unseen hand, sending a sharp chill through the stale air. A gust of icy wind swept out from beneath the door, swirling around his feet and snuffing out the faint light in the hallway. His heart pounded in sudden urgency. The apartment, once a familiar refuge, felt transformed, its walls closing in, the rooms shrinking beneath an invisible weight. David moved swiftly, his breath shallow and quick, as the lock clicked open, revealing darkness beyond, yet a darkness that pulsed with a life of its own. Desperation surged through him. He fled to another room, slamming the door behind him, frantically searching for anything to barricade the entrance. A chair was dragged into place, followed by a heavy dresser wedged tight against the frame. The sounds that followed were unlike anything he had ever heard, soft thuds, scratches, as if something pressed and scraped just beyond the door. He reached for his phone, hoping to call for help or at least connect to the outside world. But the screen remained stubbornly blank, no signal, no calls, no messages. The apartment was cut off, an island suspended in silence and shadow. Isolation, once familiar, now felt absolute. No comforting hum of electricity, no reassuring voice on the line, just the relentless, oppressive quiet broken only by the eerie noises pressing in from beyond the barricaded door. David's mind raced, trapped between panic and disbelief. Was this the effect of too many days alone, or had something changed in the walls around him? Whatever it was, it refused to be ignored. The locked door was no longer a mystery. It was a gate to something waiting, something restless, something that refused to stay contained. In that moment, trapped and silent, the apartment was no longer just a home. It had become a prison, a place where isolation gave way to a presence far darker than loneliness. In the suffocating darkness behind the barricaded door, something shifted. The scratching grew louder, sharper, like fingernails tracing desperate patterns on old wood. David's breath caught in his throat as the sound morphed into a faint, irregular tapping, as though whatever was there was trying to communicate, or perhaps to warn. His hands trembled as he pressed his ear against the door. There was no voice, no clear sound, only a cold stillness, punctuated by faint, uneven noises that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The air grew colder still, biting at his skin and filling his lungs with a chill that felt like ice creeping into his very soul. Summoning a courage born from terror, David grasped a flashlight and approached the door once more. With a deep, shaking breath, he turned the handle slowly, the lock clicking open with a dry, echoing sound that seemed to resonate through the silent apartment. Beyond the threshold, the space was not what he expected. The room was empty, save for strange symbols scrawled across the walls in a dark, unknown substance, twisting and intertwining like a language from a nightmare. In the center, an old mirror stood crooked against the far wall, its surface cracked and fogged. David's reflection appeared warped, distorted, his eyes sluggish, his movements out of sync with his own body. As he reached out, the reflection did not mirror his motion, instead remaining still, watching. Then, as the flashlight flickered, a whisper emerged from the mirror's depths, soft, chilling, carrying a voice that was both his own and not. "You're not alone." Frozen, David felt a cold hand close around his wrist, though when he looked, nothing was there. The room pulsed with a malevolent energy, as if the very air had turned hostile. The boundaries of reality blurred, leaving David caught between what he could see and what he feared was true. Trapped within a space where the familiar had twisted into something unrecognizable, and the locked door had opened into a darkness he could not escape. The next morning, David's apartment was silent once more. The locked door stood closed as if untouched, the strange symbols erased by time or shadow, and the mirror's surface smooth and unbroken. But David himself was gone. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, no cries, no footsteps. The only sign of disturbance was the faint smell of cold air lingering in the hallway, a whisper of something unseen that had passed through. Days later, the landlord found the door securely locked again, with no signs of forced entry. Questions swirled, but no answers came. Some who visited the apartment spoke of a presence, a weight in the air, a feeling of being watched from just beyond sight. Others claimed to glimpse shadows flickering in empty rooms, or hear faint tapping sounds from behind closed doors. David's disappearance became a quiet warning that some doors in our lives are locked not to keep things out, but to keep things in. And in the spaces we think are safe, there may dwell secrets too dark to confront. Isolation, it seemed, was never truly alone. Claire lived alone in a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town, a place where the nights stretched long and the silence was thick enough to swallow sound. During lockdown, the world beyond her walls seemed to fade away entirely. No visits, no voices, just the slow passage of days marked only by the ticking of a clock and the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. In those quiet hours, her phone became her only connection to the outside world. But soon, that connection grew strange. At first, the calls came without a voice, a dial tone, then silence. She tried to dismiss them as a glitch, a prank, or the restless energy of isolation playing tricks on her mind. Yet the calls were persistent, arriving late at night, always lasting exactly 3 minutes. The silence on the other end became a presence of its own, filling the space with something unspoken and unseen. It was in the pauses between breaths, in the faint static that buzzed just beneath the surface. And as the nights wore on, that silence began to feel less empty, more like a quiet invitation, a summons she could neither understand nor resist. This was a solitude unlike any she had known. Not peaceful, not healing, but charged, alive, as if something was reaching out, searching for a way inside through the thin thread of her phone line. As the days wore on, Claire found herself caught in a strange rhythm, the regular ringing of the phone becoming both a lifeline and a source of growing dread. Each call came like clockwork in the dead of night, breaking the silence with its hollow, empty sound. She would answer, only to be met with a lingering quiet so thick it seemed to press against her eardrums. At first, she told herself it was a prank, a cruel joke from someone on the other side of the line, or perhaps a fault in the network, a glitch echoing through the wires. But the calls never wavered, always at the same hour, always lasting exactly 3 minutes, and always with the same suffocating silence. Claire began to notice small things, subtle changes in her surroundings during the calls. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed to lengthen and shift, moving in ways that defied the flickering candlelight. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath, listening alongside her. She tried to ignore it, to focus on work, on the passing hours. But the calls clawed at the edges of her mind, seeping into her thoughts like an unwelcome fog. During one particularly restless night, the silence broke, faint, almost imperceptible whispers threading through the static, voices just beyond comprehension, calling out her name in a breath that was both distant and painfully close. Each night, the presence on the other end seemed to grow bolder, more insistent. The house echoed with sudden creaks and knocks timed perfectly with the ringing, as if the walls themselves were responding to the call. Claire's solitude was no longer peaceful. It had become a waiting game with something unseen, something that waited patiently for her to answer. With every passing night, the calls grew more unsettling. No longer just silent, the line began to carry faint sounds, soft breaths, the distant rustle of fabric, and sometimes a barely audible whisper that sent a chill creeping down Claire's spine. The voice remained indistinct, a fragile thread of sound just beyond clarity, tugging at her nerves and unraveling the fragile calm she had managed to hold on to. The house responded in kind. Doors creaked open slowly on their own, lingering just long enough to send a shudder through the empty halls before snapping shut again. Lights flickered, plunging rooms into shadows that twisted unnaturally. At times, Claire caught glimpses of movement, a shadow flitting across the periphery of her vision, gone the moment she turned to look. Her phone, once a source of connection, became an instrument of dread. Calls would start abruptly in the middle of the day, the silence hanging heavier, darker. Sometimes, the screen would light up with a new contact saved simply as unknown, a name she never recognized, yet a number that seemed to follow her wherever she went. One evening, as she sat alone in the dim glow of her living room, the phone rang again. This time, when she answered, the silence shattered. A voice whispered her name, slow and deliberate, filled with a chilling familiarity that made her blood run cold. The voice didn't speak any further words, but that single utterance was enough. The walls of her home seemed to close in tighter, the shadows deepened, and an overwhelming sensation of being watched settled over her like a suffocating veil. In that moment, Claire realized that the calls were not random. They were a summons, a tether pulling her towards something she could neither see nor understand, something that had found her in the silence, waiting patiently to cross the boundary from voice to presence. One night, as the clock struck midnight, Claire's phone rang again. Hands trembling, she answered, expecting silence, as always. But this time, a voice came through, clear and low, carrying a weight she couldn't explain. It was a voice that knew her, spoke to her, but was not her own. "Open the door," it whispered. The room grew colder instantly, the air thickening with a presence that pressed against her skin. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepened, crawling across the floor like living things. A sudden slam echoed through the house, doors rattling violently, windows shuddering as though under assault. Claire's breath hitched, heart pounding fiercely in her chest as she moved toward the front door. Her fingers brushed the cold handle, every nerve screaming to resist, but the voice pulled her forward, relentless. With the door open, she stepped outside into the still night. No one was there, only darkness, vast and endless. The voice whispered again, now from everywhere and nowhere. "You left the door open." A gust of icy wind swept through the house, extinguishing the lights, plunging her into darkness. In that moment, the fragile line between the world she knew and the unknown shattered. Claire was no longer just a listener on the other end of the calls. She had become part of something far greater, far darker, a presence trapped between the silence and the voice. The following day, the calls stopped. The silence returned, thick and heavy, as if the house itself held its breath. But Claire was changed. The once familiar rooms now felt cold and distant, shadows lingering where light should have reached. Her phone now bore a new contact, simply labeled the voice. When she tried to call back, the line went dead, swallowed by an emptiness that seemed to stretch beyond the reach of any signal. Neighbors reported hearing faint whispers carried on the wind, voices that vanished when approached. Some spoke of seeing a figure standing at the window, staring out with eyes that held no light. Claire's story became a quiet warning, a reminder that even in isolation, we are never truly alone, and that sometimes the voices we hear through the silence are not echoes of the past, but something waiting to step through the shadows. What reached out to Claire in those quiet nights remains unknown, but the line between phone and presence, between voice and reality, had been broken. And on the other end, something still listens. Which of these stories scared you the most? Have you ever experienced something strange or unexplainable while alone? Share your thoughts, your fears, or your own stories in the comments below. We want to hear from you. And if you want more true tales that will keep you up at night, Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss what's lurking just beyond the shadows.